Yeah, all right, thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and indeed the work of this movement, the longevity community in general. The reason why I'm here, and I guess the reason why quite a few of the speakers are here, not only today but over the next couple of days, is because there has come to be a really significant overlap, a really significant intersection between the longevity community and the psychedelics community. And that's for a very good reason. There is a lot to be said for the, well, just let's call it the mind-body connection in terms of longevity, the impact of stress on the physiology of the body, on the parts of the body that we don't think about necessarily as being overtly connected with stress. That connection is actually really strong. And this has been known for a very long time. But over the past decade, maybe, it has increasingly become, to be of practical significance. People have identified psychedelic drugs that are genuinely, impactful, at least in a laboratory setting, in laboratory animals such as mice. And so it makes a lot of sense for the psychedelics community and the longevity community to be talking to each other. And that's why I'm very happy to be here. Now, the thing I'm not happy about is I don't have a clicker. Okay. Oh, yeah, thank you. All right, so I lead a nonprofit based in California named the LEV Foundation, the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. It is the third nonprofit that I have led over the past 20 years, and I am proud to say that all of these organizations have made a significant contribution to the crusade, the effort to hasten the time when people simply do not get sick as a result of having been born a long time ago. That's what I work on. So why do I work on this? Well, basically, I started working on it because hardly anybody else was doing so. That has changed substantially, and I must say that one of the things I'm most proud of is that I have contributed quite a bit to building this community. But let's start from the beginning. The fact is that it's a little bit paradoxical that aging is such a problem, that people still get sick when they get old, even though more than 100 years ago, nearly 200 years ago, we started to figure out, rather successfully, how to stop people getting sick when they have not yet got old. In other words, how to prevent and cure the infectious diseases that used to do in so many people. It was so easy. I mean, look at it, for goodness sake. Just figuring out that hygiene was a good idea. That has saved the most incalculable number of lives. And simple things like, vaccines and antibiotics and even mosquito nets. The number of lives that have been saved is huge. So we have to ask ourselves this question: what is the difference between those diseases and the diseases and disabilities of late life that we have had so little impact on thus far? If we don't ask ourselves that question, then we're not going to find the right answer. So much of science and technology is about figuring out what's the right question. So a lot of people think that the answer is this, which is the wrong answer. A lot of people think that the main reason why in fact, the only reason why we have failed to bring the health problems of late life under medical control is that there are so many of them, that you have so many things going wrong with you at more or less the same time. And of course, because it's more or less the same time, they interact with each other, they exacerbate each other. So most people think it's the sheer complexity that has overwhelmed the medical crusade, the medical effort. Now, I'm not saying that's completely not true, but I am telling you that it's not the main reason why we have been so unsuccessful thus far. In order to introduce what is the main reason, I'm going to explain a little bit about, well, I'm going to give you a little terminology lesson, actually. That's really what I'm going to do. If you ask most people this question here, in what ways can somebody be sick? Then the answer they give will be, to a good approximation, what you're seeing on this little table here. They'll say, well, all right, there's, I've got a laser pointer. It doesn't work very well, but there you go. They'll say, well, there's infectious diseases. That's column 1. The kind of things that I've just mentioned that we're already pretty good at keeping under control. Then there's genetic diseases, inherited things, that very small numbers of us are unlucky enough to get on account of the DNA that we got from our parents. Then there's the big one, column 3, the chronic progressive diseases of late life. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and so on, almost all cancers, atherosclerosis, osteoporosis, all of those things that I put up in ridiculously small font earlier on. By the way, in case you were wondering, you were not supposed to be able to read that slide. It was like just for effect. And then, you see, the thing is that most people will say that way out in the stratosphere, there's this other fourth thing called aging itself, which consists of these rather nebulous, rather poorly defined things like frailty, and sarcopenia, which means the loss of muscle. And, most people will genuinely feel that there's this big black line there, that there is like no similarity whatsoever between the things we call disease and the things we call aging. And that's a bit of a problem, because what it ends up like communicating and making people think is that the things in column 4 are off limits to medicine, even in principle, not just now, in principle, which is a bit of a disincentive to have a go at developing those medicines. So I want to disabuse you of that. I want to dispose of that misconception. And I'm going to do so rather carefully. I'm going to carry on with the terminology for a little while before getting on to the real science. What is aging anyway? The thing is, that's actually, it's ridiculous that that's a question. Aging has been the number one preoccupation of the human race since the human race existed, since civilization began. And yet, we still, you ask 10 people what they think aging is, and you'll get at least 10 different answers. It's ridiculous. So I'm going to give you this definition. And the reason I like this definition is not only because it's a good one, it's accurate and all that, but also because it demystifies aging. It actually tells you in real terms what aging is in a manner that helps you to understand that it's not an enigma, it's not a mystery. So aging is simply the combination of two processes that I'm showing you on the bottom of this slide. There's one that goes on throughout life, and I mean really throughout life, starting before we're born, and that is the creation of what I'm calling damage. Now, this is created by our metabolism. Metabolism is the word that biologists use to denote the entire universe of processes, the entire network of processes that keep us alive from one day to the next. It creates damage. Now, what is damage? It simply changes to the structure, the molecular and cellular structure and composition of the body that are consequences of keeping us alive, of the processes that keep us alive. Fine. Why do I use the word damage? Simply because of the other process, the one on the right. The body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of these changes that I just mentioned, but only a certain amount. And that is why eventually we get sick, because eventually there's more of that change than what the body is set up to tolerate, and that's when we start going downhill. Our function, both mental and physical, starts to diminish, and eventually we get very sick and we get dead. That happens late in life. It only happens late in life, and the reason why is simply because the body is set up to tolerate a fair amount of that damage, and therefore nothing really goes wrong until middle age or later. All right, so that tells us what was wrong with the table that I put up 2 slides ago. If you look at this version of that slide, you will see that the columns are exactly the same as they were last time. There's no differences. The only difference between this version of the slide, of the table, and the previous one is the location of that big, thick black line. That is a big deal for two reasons. The first reason is it answers the original question I had right at the beginning. If there's really a huge difference between the so-called diseases of late life, column 3, and the communicable diseases, the infectious diseases, column 1, then, it kind of isn't surprising that the same kind of medicine that we've already developed that works so well against column 1 doesn't work against column 3. It's less surprising than it was. But much more importantly, there's no black line anymore between column 3 and column 4. That is critical, because what it tells you is there is no meaningful difference between the so-called diseases of aging and the so-called components of aging itself. It's just semantics. The things in column 3 are the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to, and the ones in column 4 are the ones that we've not. And that's all. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, is that. Well, actually, it's not the only one, but it's a big one, so don't forget it. So what does that mean? Well, of course, the goal here is to keep people healthy for longer, right? Now, what does that mean in terms of my definition of aging? Very simple. It means separating, or at least weakening the link between metabolism and pathology. It means allowing people to carry on being alive, in other words, performing metabolism, and yet not get sick, not exhibit the pathology of late life. So how can we do that? Well, one way to separate metabolism from pathology in principle would be to separate damage from pathology. And that's what we do today. That is geriatric medicine. We pretend that the health problems of late life really are a bit like infections. We attack them directly in the same kind of way as we attack infections. And what do you know? It doesn't work. And it's bleeding obvious from this simple slide why it doesn't work. It doesn't work because damage is still accumulating. If you try to attack the consequences of something that's continuing to accumulate, then obviously what you're doing is going to become progressively less effective as time goes on. It's just complete no-brainer that geriatric medicine is a non-starter. Now, I'm not the first person to realize that, by any means. More than a century ago, a few people started to realize this, and that's where the whole field of gerontology came from. People said, well, this isn't going to work, is it? We've got to be more preventative. If we really want to separate metabolism from pathology, we're not going to do it by separating damage from pathology, so we've got to try and separate metabolism from damage. And they looked at the living world and they saw, well, you know what? There's a lot of variation in the rate of aging between different species. That's an inspiration. That's like reason to believe that we might, in principle, be able to develop medicines that actually fix this, that actually slow down the rate at which metabolism generates damage. You can say, makes metabolism run more cleanly. That would be one way of saying it. And that sounds pretty promising. I mean, pretty promising, except that it's not, because metabolism is a little bit complicated. This here that I'm showing you is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism actually works. And, well, hands up anyone in the audience who's ever written software? Hello? Anyone's written software? Not many, all right. So, if you have, you will recognize immediately that this is the ultimate catastrophe, the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. I mean, there is no way we are going to be able to unpick this and stop this thing from doing the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without, at the same time, stopping it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. It's just not going to happen. It's a non-starter. Of course, that's an understatement of the problem. The real problem is not so much that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works. The problem is that it's a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how metabolism works, which, as any biologist will tell you, is utterly, totally dwarfed by the astronomical, incalculable amount that we don't know about how metabolism works, even leaving out all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So forget it. Luckily, though, there's a third alternative, which I am arrogant enough to call the common sense alternative, which is we don't actually mess with the process that turns metabolism into damage or the process that turns damage into pathology. Instead, we separate those processes from each other by periodically, partially anyway, repairing the damage. That's what we need to do. Now, how does that work? Well, obviously it works because it separates metabolism from pathology the way we need to. But the key thing is it sidesteps all of our ignorance. If we don't have to slow down the rate at which metabolism generates damage, we can get away with not understanding the details of how it generates damage. And similarly, for damage translating into pathology. This is why it's not really particularly arrogant to call it the common sense alternative. We already bloody do it for simple machines. This machine here, as I'm sure you can see, is more than 100 years old. And the thing is, it didn't get that way by being designed to last 100 years. It got that way through exactly what I just described, preventative maintenance. This car should and would have been expected by its manufacturers to fall apart within 10 or 15 years. But it didn't. It's working every bit as well as when it was built. And that shows you that preventative maintenance works. It transcends the warranty period of whatever machine you're talking about. And the human body, yes, it's a ridiculously complicated machine, and yes, we don't have the plans, we don't have a blueprint, but it's still a machine. So its structure defines its function. And that means that if we can do preventative maintenance on it reasonably comprehensively, we will maintain its function. So, finally, time for some biology. This is the way in which I first described, 20-odd years ago, the way in which we might go about this. I recognize that because the body is such a ridiculously complicated machine, we have to start by putting together a classification. There are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different types of damage that accumulate in the body. But it turns out that they can be classified into a manageable number of categories. That's the things on the left-hand side of this slide, of this table. And the utility, the purpose of this classification, is defined on the right-hand side. The purpose is to classify these types of damage in a manner that can line up one-to-one with ways, with generic approaches, generic strategies for actually implementing this damage repair, this maintenance approach. Now, it turns out that actually this has gone quite well in these 20 years. Very, very little of this was even working in cell culture or let alone mice, let alone humans back then, but it's all moved rather fast. We're now at a point, coming back to the topic of the previous panel, that the private sector is heavily involved. And a lot of this, all of this is being done in startup companies now, not just in non-profits like mine or in academia. And indeed, it's also, a large part of how it got that way is because it has become mainstream. When I first put this idea out there, it was considered to be extremely heterodox, heretical. But 10 years later, it wasn't. This paper that I'm talking about here is by a huge distance the most highly cited paper in the whole of the biology of aging in this century, and it's essentially a restatement of what I had said 10 years earlier, so it's extremely gratifying. Furthermore, it's getting easier all the time. Every single one of those 7 things I listed earlier is now amenable to damage repair by more than one approach, by various alternatives. I am extremely happy about this because you never know what's going to work or how soon. The more options you have, the more arrows you have in your quiver, the better your chances are. So this is extremely good news. So what does this mean? Well, the thing is, it actually means that we might live rather a long time. One thing that I want to emphasize loud and clear right now is that I don't work on longevity, let alone immortality. And the reason I have to do that is because I get called things like the prophet of immortality in the media all the fucking time, and it pisses me off. So I want to make very clear that I don't work on that. I work on health. I'm just a medical researcher, same as any other medical researcher. But the thing is, the medical research that I do as in when it succeeds, is going to have a side effect of keeping people alive for longer. If you stay healthy for longer, people don't get eaten by lions very often anymore, right? And indeed, people don't die of infections very much anymore, at least in the developed world, and indeed increasingly in the developing world. So basically, if you can bring the health problems of late life under medical control, you're going to have this side effect that people will live longer. And if you do it by damage repair, which some people call rejuvenation, and I'm happy with that word, then what are you going to get? You're going to be buying yourself time to get progressively better at doing the same thing again and again to the same people. That's the concept of longevity escape velocity, that even though it'll be a very long time, if ever, before we can 100% perfectly repair the damage that the body does to itself throughout life, if we simply succeed in approaching that perfection at a sufficiently rapid rate, we will be staying one step ahead of the problem. That's what it's all about. And the conclusion that I've written at the bottom is just one way of saying that. That basically, once we've got the first 20, I would say, I used to say 30, I would say even 20 years now, of postponement of the health problems of late life, we're done. 20 years is easily enough time for us to develop the next step, to get the next 20, and so on. So what are we doing at LEV Foundation? Well, the main thing we're doing right now is something called the RMR project series. RMR stands for Robust Mouse Rejuvenation, and it is simply the mouse equivalent of longevity escape velocity. It is simply trying to take mice that are already in middle age and get them to stay healthy for a bit longer, a year longer, which is like 40% of a mouse lifespan, and to keep them alive longer as a side effect of that. So the way we're going to do it, as you've already seen, is going to be a divide and conquer approach, applying multiple different things to the same mice at the same time. In the first experiment of this nature that we're doing, which is happening right now, began in February, we are doing the 4 interventions that you see here. In the interest of time, I won't go through the details, but basically they are very different interventions addressing different aspects of the accumulation of damage. And we are starting this intervention in middle age, when the mice are already a year and a half old, out of the 2.5 years that they normally live. We want to make them live to 3.5 on average, which basically means if we also extend the maximum lifespan by a year, that means about 4.25 years. And we're pretty hopeful that we can do it. Maybe not this first time, but we are going to do a succession of these experiments. The key thing here, as I emphasized already, is that we are working on mouse health with mouse lifespan as a side effect, though it's a more, shall we say, unambiguous readout. But we are measuring many aspects of mouse health as well. I won't go through that because it's a bit technical. We are checking the mice every so often for things that you can't check when the mice are alive. So we do actually, on purpose, kill some of our mice so as to extract tissues and analyze them. But most of the analyses that we do not involve killing the mice, so we only kill about a quarter of them over the whole course of the experiment. Maybe I'll go into this a little bit. We are measuring a lot of things. There's things like how the mice look, how much hair they're losing. That's something that goes reasonably smoothly throughout life in mice. Curvature of the spine, becoming hunched mice. That happens progressively during aging. Things that you've all heard of, like glucose tolerance, the usual things that you might expect. And also functional things, like, we can test various aspects of cognitive function. We can test aspects of sensory function, like eyesight. We can test physiological function, like, agility or endurance. So we do all of these things. These are standard things that have been developed over many years by other groups, so we're not having to reinvent the wheel here. We are collaborating with a lot of different groups on these kinds of things, and we're very happy with any collaborators that may want to work with us. We are currently working on the design. In fact, we have basically just about finished the design of the next experiment of this nature, which we're calling RMR2, not very imaginatively. We are hoping to start it early next year, but that won't happen until we raise the money for it. So anyone who feels like helping, please see me afterwards. There are various front runners here. In fact, I can now go a little further than this. I can tell you that we're going to be doing 4 of the things that you have been listed here, as well as one other thing, which is recombinant albumin. And we're also probably going to be giving our mice, all of our mice, rapamycin, which is a particularly well-documented and well-confirmed way to increase the baseline. So that's all good. And I'm going to close by just mentioning this, which is a huge step forward in terms of the advocacy in this movement. For the longest time, there has been one huge Achilles heel, shall we say, in terms of persuading people who really matter, governments and so on, that the longevity movement is something they should support. And that Achilles heel has been the cowardice, I will say, simple as that, of my colleagues in the scientific community working on the biology of aging. The refusal of those people to come out and say, yeah, with a bit more money, we could actually do this in a reasonably small amount of time. We could actually postpone the health problems of late life by a fair amount. And this thing here, the Dublin Declaration, which you can see the link to at the top there, this is the first step in changing that. The text of this declaration is not as hard-hitting as I would be, but it's a hell of a lot more hard-hitting than anyone's ever been before when it comes to things that a majority of the mainstream in this community have been willing to sign up to. And here we do have very much a majority of the mainstream. The few people that you see up there, if anyone knows the luminaries in this field, well, there's plenty of them in that half-dozen list at the top, but we have 100 of them, and we have around 2,000 people in general who've signed up. Anyone can sign to support this. So that's it. There's my website, our website, LEV Foundation, levf.org. Please go there and have a look at what we're doing and learn more about this. I will also be around for the rest of the day, so anyone who wants to ask questions or write me a check, here I am. Thank you.